All right, my people, let's talk philosophy. Today we are going to feed a bunch of birds with one seed. We are simultaneously going to fulfill a request from Brandon McGuire over at Daily Dose of Wisdom. In so doing, we're going to provide one of a handful of really good objections to the moral argument for the existence of God, and we will cover a topic that is without question the most requested topic by subscriber, viewer, troll alike. What's a reasonable argument for objective moral obligation that does not rely on the existence of God? We're hopefully going to cover those things enough to get you thinking about them. I'll consider some objections and maybe rant and ramble a little bit. Then I will look forward to seeing you in the comments for civil, thoughtful, respectful discussion in an attempt to get closer to the truth. If none of that sounds good to you, then you should Google Australian Mountain Doodle puppies. They're adorable. So let's start with Brandon's presentation of the moral argument and his request.
Because morality is objective, and because objective morality requires there to be a moral lawgiver, it follows logically that there is a moral lawgiver, that there is actually a God. I would love to hear, I know people in the comments, I'm expecting it, I'm anticipating it. People are going to have, I think, some disagreements with that. And so I welcome those. I want to hear those. I've seen those in other videos, but I haven't really effectively seen anybody actually dismantle that core, basically syllogism.
So, Brandon presents us with his version of the moral argument, which is a really straightforward, popular way to present it. If an objective moral law exists, God exists. Objective moral law exists, therefore God exists. He then challenges us to dismantle this syllogism. A syllogism just being this straightforward sort of deductive two-premise argument. In this case, it's if P then Q, P, therefore Q. For those of you playing along at home and taking an intro to logic class, that would be modus ponens. Apparently the most popular way to attempt to dismantle this argument in the land of YouTube philosophy, atheist, theist debates, etc., is to deny that an objective moral law exists. And I promise in a future video to give you the best arguments I know of that undermine the claim that objective morality exists. But in this video, I want to do something I haven't seen anyone in the world of YouTube philosophy, atheist, theist, apologetic sorts of stuff ever do, which is undermine that initial premise that if there exists a moral law, there has to exist some sort of divine lawgiver. I'm going to give you an argument for a moral law that relies on none God. So what will it rely on? This cup of water, a Neo-Kantian argument borrowed from Christine Korsgaard, who I believe to be the greatest moral and political philosopher alive, and a little bit of special sauce from me. To begin, we're going to talk a little bit about value. In particular, subjective, instrumental sorts of value. Something like this cup of water is instrumentally valuable because it's valuable to me to satisfy a particular desire or to fulfill a particular purpose. The water is valuable to quench my thirst or to soothe my throat. And almost no one argues that instrumental value doesn't exist. We all see it all the time, everywhere, every day. We satisfy our desires, we fulfill our purposes. The problem is all of those sorts of value are clearly subjective. You might not want water. You might not be thirsty. You might be drowning in a river and the last thing you want or need is water. So you can see how it might be difficult to come up with a universal, objective moral law if it's the case that all of our values are subjective or instrumental. They depend on a person's wants or desires or needs or intentions. To use some of the examples from the video where we got Brandon's request, they discuss whether or not murder's wrong. Well, if we're saying it's totally subjective, murder's just wrong because people don't want to be murdered. That's subjective. Or they talk about child sexual assault. Well, we don't want children to be sexually assaulted, or children don't want to be sexually assaulted. But if we're basing the moral law on the wants or the desires, those are all bound to be subjective. So if we're going to have a universal moral law, we have to find something that's valuable and worth protecting that doesn't depend on anyone's subjective preferences. And that's exactly what Kant, and then Korsgaard, and then little old me are going to try to do. So let's take a look at what it takes for something like this cup of water to be instrumentally valuable. First, it takes something that I already mentioned, a desire. The water has to have the ability to satisfy a particular desire or want or need or inclination or intention, or it's never going to have any value at all. So in this case, if it's to quench my thirst, it's valuable because if I drink it, it quenches my thirst. But that clearly illustrates that having the desire isn't enough to make the water valuable, because if I can't act on that desire, I can never satisfy it. So part of what creates value in the water is my ability to act on my desire as being worthy enough to pursue. For Kant and Korsgaard, and the purposes of this argument, that means I have to have an autonomous will, a free will. And before everybody hops in the comments, there are lots of really good arguments as to how and why free will could not and does not exist. But I want you to hold on to them because I'm going to talk about free will in a way you might not be used to. And I'll address your concerns when I consider some objections. So if you hop in right now and just say free will doesn't exist, all I'm going to do is maybe tease you a little bit for being too impatient and having the attention span of a 12-year-old who was raised on an iPad. I'm trying to prove universal objective moral law. At least wait until you hear the whole argument before you fire off in the comments section. So this conception of free will consists of two parts. First, we have a deliberative will. The ability to consider options and choose. We can choose between water and coffee and bourbon and a martini and prime and Celsius and a jug of nootropics from Joe Rogan that are going to make our brains smarter. And we survey the landscape, we have all of those options, and we can consider them and make a choice. Decide which one we want and which one's going to satisfy our desire. And then in order to satisfy the desire, we have to be able to act on that choice, which is the second part of a free will. Our choice has to be able to serve as the cause for our action. I realize I'm thirsty, I survey the landscape, I choose the cup of water, and then I act in such a way to have that water satisfy my desire. So in order for this water to become valuable, I need to have a desire, then I need to be able to consider options, make a choice, and act on that desire. Another feature of this account of free will that differentiates it from the way a lot of people think of freedom is, given this account, freedom doesn't mean the ability to pursue your desires. It's the ability to choose which ones you pursue or choose to not pursue any of them at all. One needs to be able to overcome their desires, or you're just a slave to instinct or a slave to your desires. You're not making any free choices at all. So one needs to be able to say, oh, I really want to eat the entire bag of chili cheese Fritos and the entire bag of Sour Patch Kids, but I probably shouldn't because I'm a grown man and I'm not going to do that to myself. Fritos and Sour Patch Kids aside, it's not going to be enough for me to have a desire, choose how I'm going to satisfy that desire, and then go ahead and pursue satisfying that desire in order to create value. I've got to be smart enough to get it done. And for the purposes of this argument, that amounts to having a degree of practical rationality. At the very least, I'm capable of not contradicting my own purpose. I don't go grab the cup of water and say, oh, I'm so thirsty, and then dump it on my head. No, I'm not dumping it on my head. I am not that committed to the bit, and I don't think it would help you better understand the argument. I have to be able to fulfill my desire by grabbing the water, recognizing that in order to fulfill that desire, I have to drink it, and I can't contradict my own purpose by chucking it over my head. And having that degree of practical rationality, the ability to recognize and avoid contradictions, isn't really that big of an ask. If we look at Korsgaard's argument for it, it's enough for me to call your name and you to answer. Because if you respond to me calling your name, you recognize your name as referring to you and not all the beings who are not you. Contradictions can never be true, and we all get it. As Aristotle put it, it's a first principle that everybody's committed to. One could be the most extreme radical skeptic in the world, and Aristotle points out you can't be skeptical of that. Because if you're skeptical of the principle of non-contradiction, then you can't say anything or do anything. As he puts it, you render yourself mute. you turn yourself into a vegetable. Because every word you say singles out something that means something other than what it's not. Everything you do, you anticipate a particular consequence for that action because it's different from all of those consequences that you don't want. It's a condition of being the sort of conscious creature we are and existing in the world. So in order to get the value from the water, I have the desire, I have to be able to choose and then act on that desire, and I have to be competent enough to recognize a contradiction and not dump the water on my head when I want to drink it. But so far, this is just about me satisfying a desire. It's not saying anything about value, because value seems to be the sort of thing that arises when we're making a judgment about an action, or about a desire, or about choosing to satisfy a particular desire. Saying something's valuable isn't saying, ooh, water satisfies the desire. We're saying, oh, water satisfies the desire, and thumbs up for satisfying it. We're making a value judgment by saying something's better or worse, good or bad, right or wrong. And in order to do that, someone has to be capable of examining a want, a need, a desire, an action based on that desire, and the satisfaction of that desire as being good or bad. And that takes a different point of view. When I'm judging my own actions, it means I have to be able to reflect on my actions and examine them from a degree of remove. I have to be reflectively conscious. I have to be able to say, oh, drinking that water, thumbs up, or drinking that water, boo hiss, thumbs down. If I wasn't reflectively conscious, I would just be moving through the world, satisfying my desires, following my instincts, never thinking twice about it. I would be a lion ripping a gazelle's face off and eating it because the lion afterwards isn't thinking, I wonder if I should have done that a little differently. So saying that the water's valuable is different than just drinking it. It's having the desire, making the choice to act on that desire, then acting on the desire, drinking the water, and making a judgment about whether or not that was the right thing to do. Was it good or bad? Now, how does that get us to some sort of universal objective moral law without God? Well, if it takes those 4 characteristics for me to value the water, and I value the water, then I necessarily value those 4 characteristics, because without them, I could never ever get value from the water. If I didn't have the desire, I wouldn't give a shit. If I couldn't choose and act on the desire, then I wouldn't be able to create the value. If I wasn't rational, I wouldn't be able to satisfy my desire because I'd be dumping water on my head. And if I couldn't reflect and say, yeah, good job, drink water when you're thirsty, do that again next time, then I wouldn't be able to christen it valuable. It's the same as saying if I value a house, I necessarily value the bricks and mortar and wiring and concrete that goes into building it, even if I don't know that those things go into building it. So if one values anything, they value themselves as a creature with those 4 characteristics. And if they value a creature with those 4 characteristics in themselves, they ought to recognize the value of those 4 characteristics in any other person on the planet, or they're contradicting themselves. And we know they're already committed to the principle of non-contradiction, because if they weren't committed to it, they could never get value out of anything at all. You're demonstrating that all persons are valuable and that you ought to believe it, because if you don't believe it, you're contradicting yourself. You're not making an emotional mistake or a mistake of empathy or a mistake of feelings or anything subjective. You're making a factual error. You're failing to recognize that everybody else is just like you in that they are persons too. For Kant, this led to a formulation of the categorical imperative that people refer to as the humanity formulation. The categorical imperative just describes what he thought of as the universal, objective moral law that applied categorically to everybody. And the humanity formulation says, act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or the person of any other, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. To clarify a little bit, what does he mean by humanity? Well, just by humanity, one having those characteristics of humans that we described. Doesn't necessarily have to be Homo sapiens sapiens, could be aliens who have those characteristics. If it makes you feel better, just replace humanity with persons. What does it mean to say we never treat other people simply as a means? It means people aren't just instrumentally valuable. They're all intrinsically valuable because they are all the source of their own instrumental value. We can never treat other people as if they are just things like cups of water to satisfy our own needs, because as conscious beings who are capable of reflecting, acting, having desires, and acting rationally on those desires, we recognize that that's valuable to us. So all persons have to be valuable too, because they all have those characteristics as well. That's the long and short of it. And that's a pretty great conception of a universal moral law, and it's objective as fuck. Brilliant argument for objective moral value. You can find it in Kant, in the Foundations of the Metaphysics of Morals, the Metaphysics of Morals, the Critique of Practical Reason, the Critique of Pure Reason, and the Anthropology. Or if you want to just go straight to an unbelievably interesting, cool argument that just blew my mind the first time I encountered it, go straight to Korsgaard's books, Sources of Normativity and Creating the Kingdom of Ends. They were published somewhere around 30 years ago. And when I first read them, I was like, fuck, this is it. This is right. Because I can't come up with a meaningful objection to them. It makes sense. Anyone who values anything at all says that creatures like them are valuable enough to pursue the things they value because they do it. And in doing that, they're demonstrating a commitment to the idea that they're worth it. Not because of their particular collection of subjective wants, needs, and desires, but because they're the sort of creature that has wants, needs, and desires, period. So if the water's valuable, you're valuable, and if you're valuable, everybody's valuable. But there are some objections. Before we address those objections, let's make sure we fulfilled Brandon's request. In a universe with more than one person in it, we have a moral law that requires that people treat one another with dignity and respect as the sources of subjective instrumental value. And if someone values or wants or desires anything and goes ahead and pursues it and creates value for themselves, they are demonstrating that they value themselves and they value everybody else who's just like them. So let's return to the two examples discussed in Brandon's original video. How and why is murder wrong if God didn't say so? Murder's wrong because the murderer is destroying a person of value. And they're valuable because they actually and or potentially value all sorts of things. By killing them, the murderer is destroying each and every desire that they have or might have that they could fulfill. They're compromising their ability to pursue those desires and reflect on those desires and create projects and fulfill those projects. And they're depriving everybody who has a meaningful, loving, caring, valuable relationship with that person of that relationship. They're eradicating value in the world in the most profound way possible, and they should know better because they know they value themselves. How do we know they know this? Because even if their only desire is to murder someone, they're capable of attempting to fulfill that desire. What about child sexual assault? How is that wrong? Well, by sexually assaulting a child, you're necessarily violating their ability to pursue their own desires freely and rationally, because children, by definition, aren't fully rational or reflective or capable of freely choosing their desires and pursuing them. You're also likely causing them harm that's going to undermine their ability to effectively satisfy rational, thoughtful desires they might potentially have. You're violating their actual and potential personhood in all sorts of ways because they're never going to reflect the same way again. They're likely not going to have the same inclinations and desires they would have had otherwise. And they won't be able to pursue those desires with any sort of efficacy because of the assault. The person sexually assaulting a child has violated their own personhood, as they've likely decimated the actual or potential personhood of the child. So in those examples, we have very clear principled explanations of how and why things are wrong, and how and why those wrongs are lawfully wrong. What we don't have or need? God. There is no God legislating this law. The law just exists the same way we would say, 2 + 2 = 4. If the universe existed and there were 2 rocks and 2 rocks, and those were the only rocks in the universe, we'd say, oh wow, 2 rocks and 2 rocks, 4 rocks. If those 4 rocks magically disappeared, it wouldn't mean that 2 plus 2 no longer equals 4. It just would mean that there just didn't happen to be 4 rocks in the universe. If all the people in the universe disappeared, it wouldn't be the case that no longer the moral law applied. There'd be no one to apply it to. But if there's no God, who's going to hold people accountable and punish them for doing wrong things? Well, there doesn't have to be a God around to punish people for saying 2 plus 2 equals 5. They're failing to understand a principle of math that's universal and objective. People who fail to understand the universal law of morality, that all people are deserving of being treated with dignity and respect, are just making a mistake. The fact that there's no one there to slap their hands with a ruler doesn't mean the law is any less lawful. It just means the consequences of making a mistake don't involve a punishment. So we've dismantled the core syllogism at the heart of Brandon's moral argument for the existence of God by showing how a moral law could exist without God at all. And the argument we've given for the moral law is far more rationally justifiable than any argument he's ever seen, heard, thought of, or given for the existence of a particular conception of God and the moral law that that particular conception of God would legislate. And that brings us to the objections I imagine you all will have. Objection number 1 that I know someone out there has. Does this mean we only have obligations to other full-fledged persons? Because full-fledged persons can recognize that other full-fledged persons are capable of creating value. Therefore, we don't have moral obligations at all to babies or people with developmental disabilities or who are neurodivergent or have some sort of cognitive difference. It's a really good question. It's not that we don't have obligations to those creatures who aren't full-fledged persons. We just might have different obligations. When we think of an infant, we realize it's not perfectly rational or reflective or capable of acting on its own desires. But we can fill in the blank for the baby. We can recognize, oh, if they were rational, if they were reflective, if they were capable of acting on their desires, what would they do? And we can do our best to build obligations out of that understanding. If it's our child and we've entered into that caring relationship with that child by having them, we're taking it on ourselves in a way to act as a person for them, to help them fulfill their long-term morally justifiable goals, wants, needs, and desires. That's part of what it means to be a parent. So in certain circumstances, someone or something not being a full-fledged person won't mean we have fewer obligations to them, but perhaps we have more. If we think about animals, for example, animals certainly aren't reflective in the same ways that we are, and they aren't rational and understanding in the same ways we are. If you've ever taken or tried to take a cat to the vet and it goes full crazy ninja warrior on the cat carrier and it won't go in because it associates the cat carrier with the vet and it associates the vet with discomfort, it doesn't understand that the treatment it's getting there is going to help it. You might have an extra special obligation to address its suffering or pain or discomfort that you wouldn't have to a human adult person, because a human adult person you can say, hey, you're going to get a shot and it's going to make you feel better even if it hurts in the short term. The cat doesn't know that about its future. So the capacities one has for this sort of moral psychology we've described and the characteristics it takes to value something determine what sorts of obligations full-fledged persons have to those creatures, but it doesn't necessarily mean they have less. Objection 2. What about a Nazi, Klansman, serial killing, rapist, predatory, pedophile, torturer, murderer, jerkface? Do we have to treat that psychopath with dignity and respect? Yes. That doesn't mean we have to be nice to them, though. That doesn't mean we have to let them do whatever they want. Their beliefs and actions demonstrate that they're unwilling or incapable of living up to the standard that is required merely by existing as a rational, reflective person who has wants, needs, and desires and is capable of controlling to any degree one's own behavior. They're the ones who've diminished themselves, so we don't have the same obligations to them anymore. Maybe they're broken, and maybe we can fix them. Or we have to just say, hey, you're responsible for your choices. You're responsible for acting on your own desires when they violate other people in the most profound ways possible. So we are going to have to punish you, and likely pretty damn severely. Hell, we might even be justified in killing you. But why the death penalty is morally justifiable, but we should probably never ever actually practice it, is a topic for another video. 3. What about the objection that free will doesn't exist? It's a good objection. The fact is, there is no remotely reasonable, robust, thoughtful, metaphysical account of how free will could work in the world. But I don't think we need that account. If you're watching this, you're likely familiar with some of the arguments that the presuppositional apologists make when they want to say, oh, if you don't believe in God, you can't believe in anything. You can't trust anything. But arguing that free will doesn't exist because you can't have a thoroughgoing materialist or naturalist explanation of how it works is sort of the same argument. Because the same way I say to the apologist, I just do trust what I believe a lot of the time. Whether or not we have some robust metaphysical account of how free will works, we all act as if we're free all the time, everywhere. And if you say, no, I don't, you're full of shit. Because if I give you a menu with 1,000 things on it, you're not going to just be like, read it and be like, oh yeah, number 73. No, you deliberate, you think about it. When I ask you to put together the coolest Spotify playlist for a road trip, you don't just say, oh, I'm programmed to need this song, this song, this song, this song. You think about it and deliberate and act on it. So on completely pragmatic grounds, we all necessarily act as if we're free, and that psychological freedom is more than enough to get this moral law off the ground because we recognize we act as if we're free and everybody else acts as if they're free as well. Yeah, but what about like a Nietzsche-flavored objection that this is all just some kind of social construct and really we can transcend it and there's no objective universal moral law? Or the egoist objection that people are just all out for their own self-interest in some way? Well, if I found Nietzsche's syphilitic, old, tired, pathetic ass on one of his long walks and just beat the hell out of him, and if I said my beating the hell out of him brought me a tremendous amount of satisfaction, in a million years he wouldn't be saying, Sehr gut, Übermensch. There's nothing wrong with what you're doing. I just strongly prefer you not do it. He would recognize that there was something wrong with it. One last question that a lot of people have. Isn't this just the golden rule? Well, there's one important difference. The golden rule is almost always presented as treat people the way you want to be treated. This rule doesn't depend on your particular wants. It just depends on the fact that you have them. Your particular wants, needs, desires, and preferences are subjective. That you're a creature who has wants, reflects on them, acts on them, and creates value for yourself by pursuing them is just a fact about the world. So this demands that you treat people with dignity and respect regardless of what you want and regardless of what they want, as long as you're both treating others with dignity and respect. The bottom line is, if you're rational and you're sane, you have an obligation to recognize the fact that you believe you matter. And if you matter, then everyone else matters too. This is a difficult argument to wrap one's head around, and the best way I know how to present it is in a classroom where I can lead a discussion and ask questions and answer questions in real time when they come up. I don't think I clearly explained how each of the criteria for a person led to one's moral agency. I didn't talk clearly or enough about how this whole thing arises from the existence of more than one conscious being in the world, and how objective moral facts might be describing relational properties. And that's what we might be talking about with regard to moral obligation. This video is just kind of an introduction, and I want to make sure you realize if there are any mistakes, I am sure they are mine. Don't let that dissuade you from reading Kant or reading Korsgaard. Because this was tricky for me, I appreciate you even more than usual for hanging in there. And I'm probably more committed than ever to really trying to address any and all meaningful, thoughtful, respectful criticisms, questions, concerns, arguments that show up in the comments section. Thank you so much for the time. I really appreciate it. I look forward to seeing you in the comments, and hopefully we can have a discussion that'll lead us both closer to the truth. Thanks so much for the time.